Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Cowden. I am the creator of this six-part course on psychology and happiness, and I'm really excited to be sharing part one with you today. Okay, so the purpose of this course is to provide you with knowledge and tools that have been studied and proven to effectively improve happiness and well-being. I do want to point out just for a moment that these are more general concepts that can be used to increase your overall happiness and well-being. For more specific help with things related to like mental health problems or really difficult life circumstance, I always recommend meeting with a therapist. However, the benefit of this course is it can be used in combination with therapy, or if you feel like you're not in a circumstance where you need therapy, these concepts can also be used for you to help increase your overall happiness. And in addition, I think it's beneficial to learn about these so that we can share them with our loved ones to also increase the happiness and well-being of our loved ones. Okay, so today in part one, it's going to be a little bit more of an introduction. I'm going to be talking a little bit about happiness and our social relationships. In part two, I'll be talking about building and maintaining quality intimate relationships. In part three, we'll be talking about building self-compassion, decreasing negative thinking, and cultivating optimism. In part four, we'll be talking about diet and happiness, our relationship with food, and the brain-building power of exercise. In part five, we'll be talking about stress management. And in part six, which is personally my favorite, we're going to be talking about resiliency and how to build it both in ourselves and in our children. And we'll also be talking about how to grow following a traumatic experience. All right, so for a moment, could you just pause and ask yourself, do you think most people are generally happy or unhappy? What do you think? So, according to a survey on the happiness of Americans that has been conducted every year since 1972, most Americans every year have reported that they're more likely to say that they are happy than unhappy, which was surprising for me. I didn't know that since 1972, most of us generally are happy. However, the most recent survey shows that Americans are the most unhappy they've ever been since the study began. Um, Currently, most of us are more likely to say we are unhappy than very happy, which is kind of a surprising shift. And what's really interesting about this shift is it seemed to happen around the same time as the pandemic, which is really interesting. And I'd ask you to just reflect for a moment and think about why that could be. Okay, so let's talk about what determines happiness. So, according to researchers, there appears to be three things that determine our overall level of happiness. So, the first one is genetics. So, we are all born with a happiness set point that is determined by our DNA. So, some of us are just born more happy than others. The second one is circumstances, and these are the things that are not in our control. So these are the things that happen to us and the circumstances we're born into. So what families we were born into, what country, what city we were born into, things like that. The third one is intentional activity. And these are actually the things that are in our control. So these are the thoughts and behaviors that we have control of. Now just pause for a moment and ask yourself, which of these determinants do you think contributes the most to our overall happiness? Okay, so according to researchers, the evidence suggests that genetics determines 50% of our happiness. Intentional activity, or the things that are in our control, those contribute to about 40% of our happiness. And our circumstances, or the circumstances we're born into, or the things that happen to us that are not in our control, that only makes up about 10% of our overall happiness level. And I found this very interesting because I was actually surprised by this. If you were to ask me, I would think circumstances would contribute a whole lot more than just 10%. So I was just curious and just wondering, was this surprising for you? So let's talk for a moment about why do our circumstances only account for 10%? So this is because of something called hedonic adaptation. And this refers to the fact that after repeated exposure to the same positive or negative stimuli, our happiness eventually returns to its general set point. So for example, something I found really interesting, a study on lottery winners showed that when they first won the lottery, their happiness did experience this boost. However, 1 year later, when the researchers followed up with them, after 1 year, even though they still had all this accumulated wealth, their happiness adapted and it actually went back to its set point. In addition, research also shows that the correlation between wealth and happiness is actually quite weak. So for example, if we were to experience a promotion or a pay raise, our happiness briefly will be boosted. We will be happier. However, our brains kind of adapt to this new circumstance and we kind of just go back to our set point. So overall, this adaptation really does happen where when our circumstances do change, we do tend to adapt to them and come back to our general set point. But what about more severe and more traumatic circumstances? And I just want to talk about this for a minute. So research shows that really more severe things like living with a severe physical or mental health problem, or living in an abusive circumstance or poverty, things like that, those do significantly bring down our happiness and well-being. So these type of circumstances really can take a toll on our happiness and well-being. And I want you to consider that because these are not things that we should overlook. They are critical to our happiness, these types of circumstances. The key point that I'm hoping you understand is once our basic safety and life needs are met, like we have enough wealth to provide for our basic needs and our health is good, and we live in a healthy environment, trying to change our circumstances by grasping at these more materialistic things really does not contribute to our happiness. It might increase our happiness briefly for a short moment, but eventually we will adapt and we will come back to our happiness set point. Okay, so what about hedonic adaptation and intentional activity? So according to researchers, research shows that the effects of hedonic adaptation are weaker with intentional activity than they are with those circumstances. So why is that? Well, researchers believe that it's because adaptation happens when something remains constant over time. Therefore, things like novelty and variety in our lives challenge hedonic adaptation. So because we cannot spend all of our time thinking and doing the exact same thing, intentional activity is more resilient against hedonic adaptation. So we adapt less to new activities than we do to new circumstances. Also, intentional activity can directly counteract hedonic adaptation. So for example, the intentional activity, such as pausing to savor the good things in our lives, can directly counteract hedonic adaptation to our circumstances because we are drawing attention to the features that produced the initial happiness boost and helping it to keep it from being taken granted for. So when we keep bringing to mind the thing that initially created that boost, we are providing a little bit more variety in our circumstance, and that can directly counteract hedonic adaptation. All right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about intentional activity, that 40% that is in our control. So making the best use of the 40% that is in our control, research shows really can significantly increase our happiness from our general set point. Also, it can have a positive impact on our circumstances by, number one, helping us avoid negative circumstances. So for example, if you choose to eat healthy and exercise, that can help us avoid things like cancer and heart disease. And those type of events can significantly bring down our happiness and well-being. Additionally, it can help us to be more resilient when negative events inevitably happen. So for example, research shows that self-compassion seems to be one of the most effective ways to build resiliency. And we can choose to cultivate self-compassion by practicing it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about self-compassion in the coming courses. Additionally, it can help us improve our negative circumstances. We can choose to improve our negative circumstances by choosing to respond to them in ways that enhance our happiness and well-being. So for example, research actually shows that many people who experience a traumatic event in their life actually grow from the experience and are more resilient and more happy than they were prior to the traumatic event. And a lot of that is because they chose to work on changing their perspective on the traumatic event that happened. So we're going to talk a little bit more about growing from traumatic experiences in the upcoming classes. Okay. So let's talk about this incredible study that I found so interesting. It is the longest study on happiness. And it began in 1938 by a group of Harvard researchers, and they sought to determine what creates a happy life. And they did this by gathering 724 participants and followed them throughout their lives. They examined their health records and asked them very detailed questions about their lives every 2 years. Um, and what they have found every year consistently since this study began is the primary predictor of happiness is our positive relationships. But what's even more interesting, well, what I found more interesting is that it's also the primary predictor of longevity or living a long life and our physical health. So this was an incredible study that not only do positive relationships predict our happiness in life, it also predicts our physical health and our longevity. What this study also found was at the beginning of the study, a lot of the participants were teenagers, and these teenagers reported that their primary goals in lives were to become rich and famous because they believed this was what was going to make them happy. But what this 85-year-long study has consistently found is things like wealth and fame and these materialistic things do not contribute to our happiness. Kind of like what we talked about with hedonic adaptation. We really do adapt to these changing circumstances, which is why searching after material things really is not going to contribute to our happiness at all. It's really our positive relationships. Okay, so since positive relationships have been shown to be so important to our happiness, we're going to be focusing on some of the fundamentals of social connections. So we're first going to talk about our body's response to social interactions, positive relationships in our physical health, being likable, loneliness and quality relationships, emotional contagion, and empathy. Okay, so the science behind social interactions. So according to psychologist Dr. Susan Pinker, during face-to-face interactions with people, oxytocin is released. And oxytocin is this incredible hormone that creates calming feelings of trust and connection. Dopamine is also released, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter that creates feelings of pleasure, reward, increases energy, and actually can reduce feelings of physical and emotional pain. Also, cortisol is decreased, and you may have heard of cortisol. Cortisol is the hormone that is released when we're experiencing the stress response. Okay, so our social connections, interacting with people, can actually reduce stress because cortisol can make us feel stressed, but it also, when it surges through our bodies, it promotes this chronic inflammation throughout our body. So it's really unhealthy for our bodies. In addition, research shows that having chronic and high levels of cortisol can actually change the structure of our brain. So it's also really bad for our brain health. So the power of social interactions reducing this cortisol is actually quite significant. It shows that our social interactions truly are beneficial for our mental and physical health. However, Dr. Pinker states that these benefits are not experienced to the same extent during virtual interactions. To experience these effects to the fullest, we really need to be in person with our loved ones. However, this isn't always possible, either because of long distance or illness or things like a pandemic. We can't always be doing face-to-face interactions. So in these circumstances, Dr. Pinker actually recommends FaceTiming our loved ones. We're using some type of technology that allows us to see our loved ones in the eyes, to see their faces and see their facial expressions. These are the types of things that allows our bodies to release these hormones and decrease cortisol. So when you're in these circumstances, try to make efforts to interact with your loved ones in some way where you can see them, where you can see their faces. Okay, so clearly interacting with meaningful people in our lives has a positive impact on our bodies. And studies conducted by Yale, Harvard, and others have found that those who described positive relationships in their life had a 340% lower rate of premature death, significantly better cardiovascular health, a significantly decreased risk of developing cancer, and a significantly decreased risk of developing an illness in midlife. So really, there is this true power to social connections, just in our not just in our minds, but in our bodies. Okay, let's talk about likability for a minute. So meeting new people can be difficult for many of us because, according to researchers, social evaluations are one of life's greatest fears. We all worry so much about being liked and accepted. And research shows that being accepted by our peers and those around us really is a survival instinct. When we don't feel like we're being accepted by others, it kind of triggers this sense that our lives are in danger. It can create feelings of panic and anxiety. So it makes sense why social evaluations can feel so threatening. However, a team of researchers from Yale, Harvard, and Cornell actually found that people fundamentally underestimate how much our conversation partners enjoy us and enjoy our company. So, in other words, this research proves that we tend to believe that we are not as liked as we actually are after an interaction with someone new. Now, I'd like you to just pause for a moment and think about your experiences. Why do you think that we fundamentally tend to underestimate how liked we are by other people, especially with new interactions? Okay, so according to researchers, there's a couple of reasons why we do this, why we underestimate our likability. The first is we tend to have higher standards for ourselves than we do for others. The second is we overestimate how much our feelings are on display during social interactions. So, for example, the researchers explain that we tend to think that our self-consciousness that we felt was obvious and apparent to those around us, even when that was not the case. In our minds, we were coming across nervous and stammering, but the reality is that others cannot see these more covert behaviors. They actually are focusing more on those overt behaviors that we express. And the third reason is we want to be liked. So we call to mind our perceived mistakes during our conversations in an effort to improve for next time. So we're being overly critical with ourselves because we're actually trying to improve our likability. Um, However, these three things can really cause us to ruminate about our perceived mistakes following an interaction, and it can cause us to catastrophize and focus on the worst possible outcomes following an interaction with someone, especially someone new. So, what does make someone likable? Well, according to the most successful relationship self-help book of all time, written by Dale Carnegie, titled How to Win Friends and Influence People, there's 6 ways to be well liked by others. The first is to become genuinely interested in the other person. Smile. Remember that a man's name is to him the sweetest and most important sounding language. Be a good listener. Engage others to talk about themselves. Talk in terms of the other man's interests and make the other person feel important, and do it sincerely. These tips that Carnegie gave, they're not just opinions about how to be liked. Research also supports Carnegie's advice that offering genuine smiles and then focusing on the other person, being warm, interested, and enthusiastic can actually increase our likability. So a couple lessons I would like you to remember from a couple of these studies that we've talked about on likability is the first is when you catch yourself being overly self-critical following a social interaction, remember that you're probably more liked than you realize. The second is to remember that the other person you're talking to is also likely experiencing some level of stress and anxiety about how they're being evaluated by you. Remembering this will also kind of remind you of the common humanity that we all experience. It's very common to experience stress and anxiety when we're interacting with people, especially new people. So just remembering this, that this is normal, we're all experiencing this, will help reduce some of the stress that you might have with interacting with other people. The third is rather than focusing so much on yourself and trying to say the perfect things, try focusing on the other person, as described by Carnegie. By doing so, you will likely experience less stress with these social interactions, and you'll also be well liked. A wonderful quote that I wanted to share by, I believe her name is Maya Angelou, and I think it reflects really well some of what these studies have shown. It's wonderful. She said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So for a lot of us who experience social anxiety, I hope you will remember this quote and remember, try not to focus so much on being perfect and saying the perfect things and coming across the perfect way or trying to prove that you're an interesting person. Instead, just focus on making the other person feel important and being warm and kind to them. Not only will that reduce stress, but it'll also improve your likability too. Hey, a question I'd like you to ponder for a moment is, can you be surrounded by people and even be married and still be lonely? Why do you think that? So according to the CDC, and I love their definition of what loneliness is, they say that loneliness is the lack of high quality social connections. So it's not necessarily about quantity, it's all about quality. How how high quality are our social connections? That determines whether we have feelings of loneliness or not. And one of the most fascinating findings that I have seen in all the time I've done research, at my job and just, throughout school is this longest study on happiness that we've been talking about by the Harvard researchers that's been going on for 85 years. Something really fascinating they found about loneliness is that those who are lonely live shorter and less healthy lives. In addition, what I think is the most incredible finding is that loneliness is as deadly as smoking and alcoholism. And I find this interesting because I feel like ever since we were little, we've always heard about the dangers of smoking and alcoholism. We all know how dangerous it is to our physical and mental health. We haven't really talked so much about how dangerous loneliness is. And that's what I found really interesting. That is, if it's just as deadly as smoking and alcoholism, maybe we need to be talking about this more, and really considering, where are we putting our time? Where are we valuing our time? Because if it's that dangerous to our health, we really should not be undervaluing high quality relationships. Additionally, the CDC found that loneliness increases our risk of dementia by 50%, increases our risk of heart disease by 29%, and stroke by 32%, and is associated with an increased risk of suicide, depression, and anxiety. So I hope what you take from this slide is that loneliness is dangerous, not just to our mental health, but to our physical health. High quality relationships really can protect our mental health, but it can also protect us, our bodies, from illness and disease. All right, so let's talk about quality relationships. So, to ensure that our relationships are high quality, we need to be valuing them and taking care of them by practicing social fitness. So, social fitness requires taking stock of our relationships and being honest with ourselves about where we're devoting our time and whether we are tending to the connections that help us thrive. So, let's talk a little bit about how to practice social fitness and take stock of our relationships. So, according to a Harvard psychiatrist and actually the current director of Harvard's longest study on happiness, his name is Dr. Robert Waldinger, and a Harvard psychologist named Dr. Mark Schultz, in our relational lives, there are 7 keystones of support that we all need to have optimal well being and happiness. So, we need all 7 of these things satisfied. So, the first keystone of support that we need in our relational lives is safety and security. So, who would you call if you woke up scared in the middle of the night? Who would you turn to in a moment of crisis? The second is learning and growth. Who encourages you to try new things, to take chances, and to pursue your life's goals? The third is emotional closeness and confiding. Who knows everything or most things about you? Who can you call on when you're feeling low and be honest with about how you're feeling? The fourth is identity affirmation and shared experience. So, is there someone in your life who has shared many experiences with you and who helps you strengthen your sense of who you are? Number 5 is romantic intimacy. So, do you feel satisfied with the amount of romantic intimacy in your life? Number 6 is help, both informational and practical. So, who do you turn to if you need some expertise or help solving a practical problem, like maybe your Wi-Fi connection isn't working? Who would you call on to get some help with that? The 7th is fun and relaxation. So, who makes you laugh? Who do you call to see a movie or go on a road trip with? Who makes you feel connected and at ease? So, we can take stock of our relationships and determine the quality of our current relationships in our lives by using this table that was created by Dr. Waldinger and Dr. Schultz. It can make it really easy to quickly examine the quality of our current relationships. So what you do is you can create a table that looks just like this. So in the far left column, you list all of your closest relationships. And then at the top of the table, list all 7 of those keystones of support that we need filled in our lives that we had talked about. And then as you go through the table, mark an X in the appropriate column if that relationship adds to that type of support in your life. And as you go through this table, remember, it's okay if not all or even most relationships offer you all these types of support. It is unlikely that one relationship will contribute to all 7 types of support that we need in our lives. Additionally, it's probably not healthy to expect just one relationship to provide all 7 types of these supports. So this is why it's important to not just rely on one person for all of our support needs. Instead, it's important that we fill our lives with several meaningful people so that combined, they can provide us with all those types of supports that we need to enhance our happiness and well-being. So after filling out the table, assess it by identifying the strengths and the gaps. So for instance, you might realize that you have plenty of people you have fun with, but no one to confide in. Or maybe you have only one person to go to for help. Or maybe you recognize that someone you take for granted actually makes you feel very safe and secure. So once you identify the gaps in your chart, do not be afraid to start reaching out to people. Remember, it's never too late to create new meaningful relationships. And it's also never too late to deepen our current relationships with people who mean a lot to us, and increase the quality of our relationships so that we can have all of the supports that we need to improve our happiness and well-being. Okay, now we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics related to our social connections. And this is something called emotional contagion. And this is the notion that mirror neurons found in our cerebral cortex cause us to mimic on a small scale the emotions of those around us. So what does this mean? Well, when we display positive emotions around others, we make others feel good, causing us to be more likable and enjoyable to be around. So when we display these positive emotions, they feel it too, and then people are more drawn to us. Also, we can increase our happiness by surrounding ourselves with happy people. And also, emotional contagion can help us have empathy for those feeling emotional pain around us. We'll talk a little bit more about this because this is really important. So mirror neurons play an important role in our ability to feel empathy for the loved ones around us who are feeling emotional pain, because they allow us to experience a small taste of what our loved ones are experiencing. And we can use this small taste to become more empathetic and help alleviate the pain of our loved ones. So let's talk a little bit about why empathy is so important in our social relationships. According to psychologist and author Dr. Aaron Leonard, if a person receives empathy, he or she usually feels understood, less alone in their predicament, and closer to the person who gets it. This may be the most effective remedy for emotional pain. So, empathy helps us forge social connections and thus supports healthy relationships. And I really believe empathy is kind of the foundation of healthy relationships. If we can have empathy for those around us, we can help support each other when we go through difficult times, because difficult times are just inevitable. And we know that social connections provide us resiliency and really the source of strength if we're surrounded by high quality individuals who can give us that empathy we need during moments of struggle. So, according to Brené Brown, and I hope you've heard of her, she's wonderful. She's a professor, a researcher, a lecturer, and an author. And she really focuses on a lot of things related to empathy. If you haven't seen her YouTube video on the difference between sympathy and empathy, I highly recommend going and watching it because it really helps us understand what empathy is and what it isn't. So, according to Brené Brown, showing empathy does not involve trying to fix our loved ones' problems or trying to get them to see the silver lining in their situation. Rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection. So I know I'm very guilty of this. Many times when we see our loved ones struggling and experiencing emotional pain, we want to swoop in and solve their problems. We think that if we could just get them to see the bright side, or if we could just fix their problems for them, we can make them feel better, right? Because we want our loved ones to feel good. We want them to feel better. And this comes from a place of care and good intention. We really want to help our loved ones. However, as Brene Brown describes, rarely can we fix our loved ones' problems, and trying to do so can actually ruin connection. It can drive away connection. And in fact, sometimes it can even make the pain of our loved ones worse because we might unintentionally make them feel more isolated in their pain when we're not portraying that we get it. We're just trying to portray this, we need to fix the problem. We need to fix the problem. You need to see the good. That really does cause them to feel more isolated, which can exacerbate their pain rather than alleviate it. So according to Brene Brown, empathy is simply listening, holding space, withholding judgment, emotionally connecting, and communicating that incredibly healing message of you're not alone. So it's really important to remember that when we see our loved one suffering, it's not beneficial to try to swoop in and solve their problem or try to get them to see the positive in their situation. Usually, this drives away connection and can exacerbate the pain of our loved ones because it makes them feel more isolated in their pain. Instead, we should focus on connecting with our loved one and connecting with their pain, asking them questions, trying to truly understand what they're feeling. Instead of listening to respond to them, try listening to understand. Really try to connect to the pain that they're feeling and try to portray this message of, I get it. I understand why you're feeling the pain you're feeling, and I want to help you through it. I want to be here for you. Let me help carry some of this pain that you're feeling. And this truly will not only create deep connection with our loved one, but it actually can alleviate a lot of that emotional pain that they're feeling. Okay. So, in summary, we can increase our baseline happiness by taking advantage of that 40% that is in our control. Relationships are the primary predictors of happiness, health, and longevity. Meeting new people can be stressful due to fears of social evaluations. However, remember, you're probably more liked than you realize. The other person is also likely experiencing some level of stress. And try not to focus so much on yourself. Instead, focus on showing genuine interest in the other person and being positive and kind. To live long, happy, and healthy lives, we need to focus on building high quality relationships rather than high quantity. To ensure our relationships are high quality, we can practice social fitness by taking stock of our relationships and identifying areas of strength and support and gaps. Implications of emotional contagion include displaying positive emotions makes us more likable and enjoyable to be around. We'll be happier when we surround ourselves with happy people, and we can have empathy for our loved ones when they are unhappy, which allows us to build and strengthen our connections while also helping to alleviate the pain of our loved ones. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of this class, these are more general guidelines that can help improve your happiness and well-being. But if you're experiencing some, really difficult circumstances like a mental health problem or just a really difficult life circumstance, please feel free to reach out to a therapist. We have wonderful therapists at Connections Family Wellness that can provide you a lot of individualized support and resources. And you can use this number found at the bottom of the screen to be connected with one of our incredible therapists. Okay, looking ahead. So in part 2, we're going to be talking a little bit about building and maintaining quality intimate relationships. And this is a great one. This is a great opportunity to learn about some of the communication behaviors that predict divorce, how to avoid those, and how to build and maintain things like intimacy, commitment, passion. It's a great lesson. So I really hope you'll join me for that lesson. Thank you so much for joining me for this one. I hope you learned a lot and took something away that can help you improve your life and improve the connections that you have with others. Thanks again for joining me, and I will see you next time.